Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, March 22nd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the state of the United States Senate and where our competitive races are and how a new slate of polling from Emerson College, a high-rated pollster here, shows Democrats doing quite well in literally every single competitive state in this coming election cycle that Democrats have incumbents in. And looking at our slate of candidates, you have Ruben Gallego, Elisa Slotkin, Bob Casey, Tammy Baldwin, Jon Tester, Sherrod Brown, and Jackie Rosen. A lot of names should sound familiar because they all had ran for Senate back in 2018, with the exception of Ruben Gallego and Elisa Slotkin. And that means here the Democrats are already starting out with a strong advantage, having electoral incumbents run for re-election in an election year like this one. Now, the reason why I'm making this video, though we've made many about the Senate over the past couple of weeks, is because it stands in direct contrast with the state of the race according to the same pollster in these battleground states. In every single battleground state that has been polled by Emerson College, the race here has always shown Donald Trump with the upper hand against President Biden, which means these numbers here for Democrats in the Senate races show them significantly outpacing President Biden when it comes down to a congressional race that, quite frankly, matters not as much, but still very much. It shows that on the baseline here, these voters are more inclined to elect Democrats. The generic ballot in these states often show Democrats with the advantage, or in some cases Republicans with a smaller advantage than Donald Trump's top-line lead, and that really just takes away from the state when we look at it from just the presidential level. You see, taking a look at these states, it isn't just Emerson College, which I would say in its unique ability to predict correct races, it finds itself ranked in the top 10 out of hundreds of pollsters compiled by FiveThirtyEight. But it also is the fact that it matches the averages in quite literally every single one of these states as well here. Emerson says that Sherrod Brown is up by 5. The average also shows him up by 5 when you value in other pollsters. The same can be said in Wisconsin and Nevada and Pennsylvania and Minnesota, in Michigan and Montana and Arizona, and the list goes so on and so forth. Essentially what you see here is that the leads that are predicted by Emerson are in consistency with what you are seeing from other pollsters across these battleground states. And so it's of a unique point of interest to me that there is, number one, such a dueling effect here when it comes down to presidential polling and Senate polling, but also the Democrats are able to maintain these leads despite Joe Biden being so far behind. Now, if you remember anything about the 2020 presidential election, it was that there was a lot more happening than just the presidential election. Democrats were in the minority when it came to the U.S. Senate and the House. It looked like Democrats were going to try to expand seats in the House, but it was still very much up for grabs. And so the performance of President Biden, you did see have a negative impact on some Democrats in some of these closer states. For instance, states like Michigan right now, which shows Elisa Slotkin leading Mike Rogers in this battleground state here, you found the Senate race was actually more competitive than the presidential. Now you're starting to see the reverse of that, where the president, or it still is competitive, don't get me wrong on that part, but the fact is that Democrats are performing better in the Senate races than they are in the presidential race. That wasn't always the case when it came down to some of these battleground states. Now, of course, popular incumbents did well back in 2020. The Democrats were really focused on expanding their Senate majority in ways they really hadn't seen before. In states like Kansas, for instance, which don't have a Senate race up this time around, or South Carolina, when Jamie Harrison was running, which also doesn't have a Senate race up this time around. And the reason why that mattered there was because Democrats were, in theory, supposed to do well. Assuming that Joe Biden had been able to swing these states by the way the polls had predicted, or the way that Democrats were hoping, maybe there could be enough crossover support that these Democrats were going to end up winning. But when a number of Republican states ended up reverting to their priors, reverting back to 2016 instead of shifting significantly, well, it became a problem for national Democrats, because it meant at this point in time, when they were trying to win control of the U.S. Senate through all of these different avenues, like Kansas, like South Carolina, it became increasingly more difficult as Donald Trump started to expand his lead over Joe Biden. And on Election Day, when Biden is losing a state like South Carolina by 15, there isn't enough crossover support to push Democrats over the finish line. But this election seems to be different. Different in a way that there is already significant support for Democrats that are in states where Joe Biden is currently losing. In fact, in some states where Joe Biden is losing by very large amounts. For instance, in the state of Montana here, a very interesting one just simply because Jon Tester has served as this incumbent since 2006. Now, this state hasn't voted for a Democrat on the presidential level, I believe, since 1992 or 1996. All I know is that it was the Bill Clinton era, and in the 21st century, Montana has been this ruby red state that Republicans have been able to rely on in a number of elections, but not in Jon Tester's Senate seat here. Jon Tester, first elected in 2006, has won re-election in 2012 and 2018 after Donald Trump won the state by 21 percentage points. And so in this state in specific, Jon Tester maintains a lead on average of 5.5%. Why does that matter? Because Donald Trump in the same polls leads in this state by 17 and 21%. So when you're seeing Donald Trump with these large leads in a state like Montana, and yet a significant number of crossover support, it doesn't feel too reminiscent of where we were back in 2020. The numbers back in 2020 were indicating that South Carolina was going to narrow down to single digits and thus make the opportunity apparent for Jamie Harrison to win, make it, conducive to a Jamie Harrison victory or a Barbara Bollier victory in Kansas when the polls had indicated that the race in Kansas had narrowed down on the presidential to less than 12 or 11 points. But that obviously didn't end up happening. Now, the thing about Montana, though, is that you have candidates like Jon Tester, not just here, but also in states like Ohio, who have outran presidential margins, outran Donald Trump in 2018. Every single one of these states that is here has voted for Democrats as recently as 2018 at the bare minimum. And the fact is, these states have strong Democratic incumbents. And so it shouldn't come too much of a surprise. The Democrats are, in fact, clean sweeping all of these battleground states. But the question is, what does that mean for our Senate math? So what I'm going to do here is characterize all of the states that currently are held by Democrats so we can see just how limited the movement actually is in these states and how limited the movement actually is on the national, headline or takeaway from our Senate map here. Republicans are defending at most, you're talking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 seats, right? 11 seats and Democrats are defending, double the amount. And so our Senate map is already lopsided in favor of Republicans. And that starts off strong with a state like West Virginia with a retiring Democratic incumbent that isn't even considered to be a competitive race at this point. The Republican is expected to win there by 30 to 40 points. And so that brings us to a Senate map here of 50 to 50. The interesting thing is, I don't have to change anything because this is what the polls predict. Now, I will say, and I know someone's going to comment about this, so I want to say this quickly, and I will say it, a few times and probably never talk about it again. Maryland is not competitive. I really do not care that Larry Hogan is running for Senate there in the sense that it doesn't matter. I think at the end of the day, Maryland is a Democratic state, and these early polls, all this early noise that this race is going to be competitive, sure, it might narrow down by 5 to 10 points. But at the end of the day, Joe Biden is going to win that state by 25 to 30 points. Democrats have been expanding their margins in this state consistently from 2012 to 2016 to 2020. This is a state that is not going to vote red on the Senate level. You can mark my words on that. I'm telling you now, it's not going to be a point of interest for me unless you actually see consistent polling data through September and October that indicates otherwise. Because right now, Maryland, despite Larry Hogan's electoral track record, is not going to be a competitive state, and I want that to be understood right now. The most competitive race there is the Democratic primary between Angela Alsobrooks and David Trone. I would suggest you take a look into that if you're actually interested in who the next U.S. Senator will be from Maryland, because it will be one of the two that I just named. Now, back to our real competitive Senate races here. We have a 50-50 map. A 50-50 map that gives Democrats and Republicans an interesting point of view on this. What this means is that whoever wins the presidency has the Senate majority. Now, right now, those numbers look good for Republicans. But in order for Democrats to maintain control of the U.S. Senate, all of this has to stay the same, and they have to win with President Biden. The reason why it becomes impossible is because when you take a look at these other, 12 Republican states that have characterized, none of them are going to budge with the exception of maybe Texas and in a long shot, the state of Florida. Other than that, all of the other states, the other 10 states are not going to be competitive. The reason why this Senate map, you've seen Democrats been able to maintain Senate control or expand seats in terms of the U.S. Senate or hold on to a significant number of seats is because Republicans in this slate of Senate seats have often been fighting in territory that they have known for such a long period of time. Back in 2018, our Senate map looked a little bit more like this when it came down to where there were incumbents, right? Indiana had Joe Donnelly, Missouri had Claire McCaskill, West Virginia had Joe Manchin, North Dakota had Heidi Heitkamp. And so Republicans were fighting in a Senate map here. Well, quite frankly, there were a significant number of pickup opportunities, but equally a significant number of defense territory for Democrats, right? They were focused on maintaining these seats. Republicans no longer have to invest tens of millions of dollars across North Dakota and Missouri and Indiana and West Virginia, the same way they did back in 2018. Donald Trump himself went out to all of these states to campaign for these Republicans. I can guarantee you he's not going to do that now, with the exception of maybe him being bored. But I imagine in a presidential race like this one, his time will be spent elsewhere. And so now seeing it with Democrats doing better and being able to, still hold their ground in a number of these states, especially when Joe Biden is losing in all of these states. I mean, quite literally every single one of these, the averages here show Donald Trump ahead, and now most recently Pennsylvania, which has moved over to the Republican column. This is a very, very impressive feat for Democrats, and it shows just how strong their slate of Senate candidates are as of right now. Now, can things change before November? I'm never going to tell you no. I'm never going to tell you that this is a done deal and that we should, write it off entirely for Republicans, because the Senate map, quite frankly, is good for Republicans. The only places they are really going to be playing defense are Texas and Florida at most. They aren't caring about any of these other states, and neither are Democrats, and neither should be Democrats, right? They should not be spending their time focused elsewhere. The only way Democrats maintain Senate control, and I know, a year ago this would have seemed completely out of whack, but the 2022 midterm elections really changed something in my way of thinking here, that never underestimate the power of the Republican Party to lose. Never underestimate the power of the Republican Party to lose such a winnable election, because they did it back in 2022, and they may very well do it in 2024. Because the 2020 Senate map, the one that will be up in 2026, is not as conducive to a Republican advantage. And the fact is, if Democrats are to maintain control of the U.S. Senate through this map, they would be winning in 6 states that Donald Trump won in the 2016 election, and in 2 states that Donald Trump won in the 2020 election. And what we also know is that cross-party voting is so minimal, that the fact that it is happening on such a high scale in all of these battleground states is definitely a strong point for Democrats here, and goes to show just what it means to run strong incumbents, what it means to run strong candidates, and in some cases, what it means to run strong or poor Republicans, right? People like Kari Lake, who Democrats propped up in 2022 in the governor's race there, alongside, of course, the Republican Party. I mean, that cannot be lost on this, but also people like Bernie Moreno in the state of Ohio. This perfect storm is brewing, and right now, Democrats haven't had any major losses. Democrats want it to be Dave McCormick in the state of Pennsylvania. They want it to be Bernie Moreno in the state of Ohio. They've gotten both of those things. They want it to be Kari Lake. They now have that thing. In the state of Montana, they wanted Matt Rosendale, but Tim Sheehy is polling just as poorly as Matt Rosendale. And so now Democrats are saying, you know what? We can win this race. Let's not write it off. And they weren't going to entirely write it off. But what they know now is that consistently, in the recent polls, despite Donald Trump leading by 15 to 20 points in the other, same question, same electorate, who do you choose for president? Trump. Who do you choose for Senate? Tester. Right. It's very interesting. And Democrats are focusing on these races here. And Democrats, quite frankly, just have more money than Republicans. Democrats are outpacing Republicans for the DCCC, the DSCC, the DNC, the Biden campaign. Donald Trump and the Republican Party right now, quite frankly, is broke in comparison to the Democratic Party, which means limited resources, limited opportunities. And in these states, while Republicans may not have to lift as much of a finger to win in a state like Ohio and Montana against these incumbents, they absolutely do. And when you see numbers like these so early on that are indicating that, Democrats in some cases are doing significantly better than Joe Biden, significantly better than the presidential, it means that probably will maintain itself. Now, another scenario that I think Republicans need to recognize is that these numbers may not be permanent. While they may make the argument that we can narrow down the Senate races and that we as the GOP can win these races despite what these early numbers are saying, what's to say President Biden can improve? And so what we do know is this. Although President Biden may not be necessarily a hindrance to these Democrats, if these Democrats are getting support despite President Biden being at a low point ever in his presidency for approval, the low point ever in general election polling for the past 8 years for Democrats nationwide, what's to say Joe Biden's improvement wouldn't result in improvement for these candidates as well, right? There are still undecided voters out there, undecided voters in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Montana or Ohio, who could be swayed by Joe Biden and consequently swayed in favor of the Democratic Party. The main takeaway from this, I think, is right now, the Democratic Party is running up their margins, running up these numbers in a way that I think is so surprising, just because it is such a map that is so lopsided away from Democrats being able to be in a strong position, so in favor of the Republican Party, but it feels eerily reminiscent of where we were back in 2022. A winnable Senate map for Republicans with candidates that they could have nominated that they decided not to nominate, instead decided to nominate extremists or lackluster candidates, or quite frankly and plainly put, unelectable Republicans that they will reflect on and ponder on for maybe 1 or 2 months and decide to do the same exact thing in 2026. That's what I see as the future of the Republican Party as of right now, because quite frankly, this is not impressive. The Senate map is so exceptionally favorable towards them, and yet somehow they find a way to lose it. And that's not to say or discredit Democrats in their efforts to maintain Senate control. They've been working tirelessly to do it, evidently, which is why their numbers are doing so strong. But there's a reason for this. It's a combination of things. Democrats could equally be doing well as Republicans are doing poorly. And I think that's exactly what is happening in this Senate race. And if something doesn't change, Democrats will more likely than not be in a very strong position to maintain Senate control in the least favorable Senate map they have seen in the past 6 years. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist from my 2024 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.